This week on The Watchman, it's part one of a special two-part series from Washington, D.C. With anti-Semitism rising and Israel and America's enemies on the march, we head to Capitol Hill for a breaking update on all the latest national security news and why it matters to you.
We have taken back all the territory that ISIS controlled. We've decimated the caliphate, but we can't fool ourselves into thinking that the ideology is defeated.
Plus, it's one of the greatest mysteries in biblical archaeology, the Copper Scroll. What is it, and why is it so important? Find out this week, right here on The Watchman, only with Christians United for Israel and only on TBN. And welcome to The Watchman. We are here in Washington, D.C. for part one of a special two-part series from the nation's capital. Now, a major reason that we're here is to lay the groundwork and prepare for our upcoming CUFI Washington Summit. If you haven't signed up yet to join us here in Washington, D.C., visit cufi.org. That's cufi.org to get all the details. But up first, as we've told you here on the show many times, anti-Semitism is rising. Look no further than a deadly shooting recently in a San Diego synagogue. Go back a little bit further than that. October 2018, the largest anti-Semitic attack in American history, where 11 people were slaughtered in Pittsburgh by a crazed anti-Semitic shooter. So we have the threat of physical violence, but the incitement. The New York Times, which many here consider the newspaper of record in the United States, recently published a disgusting anti-Semitic cartoon featuring Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Folks, you see it there on your screen. Prime Minister Netanyahu in the form of a dog with a Star of David dog collar around his neck, being led by a blind President Trump wearing a kippah or a yarmulke. This harkens back to cartoons from World War II, published in Nazi publications. Now, they've retracted it, they've apologized for it at least twice, but the damage is done. Sadly, anti-Semitism today is becoming mainstream. Not far from where I am standing right now here in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, we now have new lawmakers, freshman lawmakers at the Capitol, who are espousing openly anti-Semitic views. I'm thinking of Rashida Tlaib from Michigan. I'm thinking of Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. Folks, these representatives working at the U.S. Capitol, elected members of Congress, are openly anti-Semitic, viciously anti-Israel. But here's the good news. Congress is still overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And one of the most forthright voices in support of Israel and the Jewish people is Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. Although Congressman Gallagher is just 35 years old, he served with distinction in the U.S. Marine Corps for 7 years, served honorably in Iraq under General David Petraeus. Now he's playing a leading role on Capitol Hill as a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Take a look. Well, Congressman Gallagher, thanks so much for joining us today here on The Watchman Show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to be here with you. Look, I think you have a very unique perspective on the Iran threat. You served in Iraq. We know the stories, the horror stories about Iranian-supplied IEDs killing U.S. soldiers. That's the tip of the iceberg. Can you talk about Iran's threat, not only in the Middle East, but to Americans?
Well, I think it's a point that's often overlooked. We consider Iran sort of in isolation or as solely a threat to Israel, but the reality is it is a threat to the United States. And it's a threat to all of our allies in the region, not just Israel. And the fact is we are seeing a historic level of cooperation between Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states, and it's because they're united in opposition to Iran. And in the past, they were united in opposition to U.S. policy, which under the Obama administration was to seek a rapprochement with Iran and throw our traditional allies under the bus. So I'm glad we've reversed that over the last 2 years, but there's a lot of work to be done. It's not just a matter of getting out of the Iran deal. It's not just a matter of labeling the IRGC a terrorist organization. We need a real, tangible policy in the region to roll back Iranian influence. That's a very difficult thing to do sometimes.
You mentioned the IRGC, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. Congressman, why are they so dangerous? They seem kind of like the power brokers in that Iranian regime.
Well, I believe they spend about $1 billion a year that goes directly to terrorist organizations around the world, primarily Hezbollah, which is their action arm, and that sows absolute chaos throughout the region. That presents a direct threat to Israel. And just look at the fact that Hezbollah in key parts of Lebanon and key parts of southern Syria has built over 200,000 advanced rockets and planted those under heavily civilian populated areas. And so this is a deliberate and cynical and barbaric strategy that's intended to force Israel, once they attack Israel, to respond in a way that incurs enormous civilian casualties and thereby incurs the condemnation of the rest of the world. This is sort of an enhanced version of what Hamas did during Operation Protective Edge. And so we have to be vigilant against that threat. And Hezbollah has, U.S. Service member blood on its hands. It's been referred to as the A-team of terrorist organizations around the world, and we can't take our eye off that ball.
Congressman, you mentioned Syria. We recently had the announcement by President Trump recognizing Israeli sovereignty over that strategic area. Why was that so important? Could that kind of be a game changer in kind of pushing back that Iranian entrenchment in Syria at Israel's doorstep?
I think it is a game changer, and I think for those who perhaps were skeptical of the move, I supported the move. I have a bill with Senator Ted Cruz that we introduced prior to the announcement that would recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, and I hope we still pass that bill because we don't want that move to be undone by a future president who perhaps has a different view. But the reason it's important, the reason it's a game changer, is we have a simple choice. Either that territory is going to be controlled by Assad and by extension Hezbollah, or it's going to be controlled by Israel. And that's not really a choice. I mean, we want that controlled by Israel, if for no other reason than that produces a far more stable situation in Syria and around the region.
ISIS has been, it seems like the caliphate has been, I guess you could say, smashed in large part in Syria and Iraq. Where are we right now with that ISIS threat? Is there a threat that they could reconstitute? How do they still threaten us here in the United States?
Sure. Well, let me say at the outset, I was part of the surge, so I really saw it go from total chaos to relative order and stability. And then when I watched a few years later when we abandoned all of our gains and we flushed it down the drain, I was deeply troubled. My town that I was deployed to, Al-Qaim, was taken over by ISIS. All the people we worked with were decimated, and that really troubled me. That's one of the main reasons I ran for office. And so I'm proud to say we're at a point today where we have taken back all the territory that ISIS controlled. We've decimated the caliphate, but we have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that Obama and Biden did in the past, and we can't fool ourselves into thinking that the ideology is defeated. I think as Sri Lanka shows, the ideology is as potent as ever. Now, the good news is the less we allow the caliphate to exist in physical space, i.e. we destroy it, the less space it will occupy in the hearts and minds of young Muslims around the world.
You're here on Capitol Hill doing important work on the House Armed Services Committee. For our viewers at home, tell us a little bit about what motivates you, how you came here to Capitol Hill, a little bit about your background, and what your mission is here on the Hill.
Well, for me, it's about service. I mean, the opportunity, I really view it as an extension of what I did in the military, right? An opportunity to pay back a debt I feel I owe to my family, to my community, to my state, my country. I mean, that really gets me energized, and I've been lucky. I mean, I didn't realize actually how lucky I was until I went abroad to places like Iraq, where they don't have a fraction of the liberties and the freedoms we have in this country. And I fought with people that were willing to fight and die for just a fraction of what we have. And that really makes you grateful to be an American. And for all the problems we have in D.C. and around the country, I mean, this is still the greatest country in the history of the world. And so to be a small part of making sure I can say that same thing when I have kids and I sort of pass the torch off to the next generation is really an honor.
Congressman, thank you so much.
We
really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Congressman Gallagher for joining us. Folks, he gave us a great overview of why the Iranian regime is such a threat to the United States. And coming up after the break, we're joined by a Kufi all-star panel which will expand on that point. Hear why a recent announcement by President Trump could be a game changer for Israel and America's security. You won't want to miss this. Stick around.
Every year, the Christians United for Israel Washington Summit gets bigger, better, and more powerful.
I have faith that with God's help, and with the men and women gathered here, with all those who cherish Israel, and with President Donald Trump in the White House, the best days for Israel and for America together are yet to come.
What's amazing about Christians United for Israel is not just the power of your voice, it's also the importance of the cause you have dedicated your voice to. Standing up against this global pressure campaign on Israel and the Jewish people goes to the heart of our friendship and the heart of America. And the tip of the spear is Christians United for Israel.
Join Pastor Hagee and top leaders from Israel and America this July for the 2019 CUFI Washington Summit. Register now at www.cufi.org/summit.
And welcome back to the Watchman from Washington, D.C. We're with our CUFI All-Star panel, Ari Morgenstern, Boris Zilberman, two of our top policy experts at Christians United for Israel. And when I think of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, anti-American activity, I think of the Iranian regime first and foremost. Now, we've been talking here on the show how they've been trying to entrench themselves on the Golan Heights on Israel's border. President Trump made a very important announcement recently regarding the Golan, Boris. What did he say, and why is it so important?
Look, I think it's a critical move where the Trump administration recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which has been the fact on the ground for over 50 years there, where after Israel fought 2 wars of survival against the Syrians and the Egyptians and other folks in the area as well, but mainly the Syrians and the Golan Heights. So it's key for keeping Israel to making sure they have defensible borders. That is, if anybody has stood on the plateau of the Golan Heights, it's pretty clear why it's important for Israel to maintain and defend, and why for anybody that wants to have a successful attack on Israel.
It's the high ground, right, Boris? It's the strategic high ground. Yeah, we've spent a lot of time there here on the show. Every few months, it seems, we're in the Golan Heights, and folks, you see the map there as well. This is indispensable for Israel's security.
Indispensable, and it sends the right message to America and Israel's enemies, whether it's the Iranians, the jihadi groups in Syria, the Russians, etc., that the United States stands with its most important ally in the Middle East.
Ari, how did the Iranians receive this announcement? Is this a game changer for Iran's plans in the region, specifically in Syria, in that Golan region?
Well, I think the Iranians received the announcement as one would expect. They were none too thrilled. Iran's plans for the region, and it goes beyond Syria. You know, obviously they're involved in Yemen and elsewhere. I think Iran, with their economic problems, I think that they're kind of, I wouldn't say they're in retreat, but they've been pushed back, I think is the best way to put it. And I think that some of that comes from policy. For example, what Boris was just speaking about, recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights sends that message. And part of it comes from Israeli action that they've taken to ensure, for example, that Hezbollah doesn't get sophisticated weapons. Sometimes that's kinetic action, that sometimes is the requirement.
I mean, major action over the past few years.
That's right.
We've seen some major flare-ups between Iran and Israel, even directly in Syria.
That's right. And I think that the Iranians, they have an eye on becoming the regional hegemon. They want to be the regional power, and they want to wipe Israel off the map. And I think
they mean it.
They mean it. And when someone says that they want to wipe Israel off the map, when someone says they're coming to kill you, you take them seriously.
If the 20th century taught us anything,
exactly right.
It taught us that.
And I think that the Iranians now are going to have to come to terms with a simple fact. The days in which they are appeased, the days in which we will sit down and dine with them at the table to try to give them something that they want in order to get a scintilla of we want, those days are over. The United States has made very clear, not just to the Iranians, but around the world, that our enemies should fear us and our allies should know that we will stand with them. And that fundamental shift in American foreign policy, borne out in our position on the Golan Heights, borne out in the recognition of Jerusalem, and borne out in myriad ways, I think that that is the key message the Iranians are going to have to hear and going to have to listen to.
This message of strength and support for Israel coming from the U.S. administration right now, how does that affect the Sunni Arab nations, Egypt, the Saudis, the Gulf states, the Jordanians, who are also threatened by this growing Iranian superpower and very concerned about it?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The Saudis, the Egyptians, the Sunni nations, they see Iran and its regional ambitions as the preeminent threat in the region. As a result, I don't think it's a secret to say that they've had quiet communications at the intelligence level and such with the Israelis, and they see now in America a president that is willing to stand up and say, I recognize the enemy, I know what the enemy is, and I will stand with those who will stand with the United States as we confront that enemy.
Boris, you're here in D.C. Some call this place the swamp. Interesting things happen here, to say the least. You're here in D.C. You have your ear to the ground working for us here in D.C. for CUFI. What's the reaction been here in D.C. circles to President Trump's much more forceful approach to the Iranian regime?
Look, I think it's paying dividends in the fact that once the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, from the Iran deal, and reverted back the sanctions that were on before the Iran deal, that they've moved forward with their maximum pressure campaign. You've seen the Iranian economy take a big hit. Their GDP is at a -6, so it is, in which that's the worst globally currently out of kind of major nations.
That's a big deal. So the people are feeling it.
The people are feeling it. Inflation is through the roof in Iran. How does that translate to, the region is, when they're sending money to Hezbollah, to other proxy groups in Syria or in Yemen, it's going to be a bigger chunk of their budget. Yeah. Their economy is hurting because of these sanctions.
Guys, it's such a dramatic sea change in policy from the Obama administration to the Trump administration when it comes to Iran. Clearly, gifting the Iranian regime with billions of dollars in sanctions relief did not work. It only emboldened them. So it seems like a very good idea to me, as you two have lined out, to change course and exert maximum pressure on this regime, which not only seeks the destruction of Israel, but the destruction of the great Satan, as they call it, the United States as well. Well, coming up after the break, we're taking it from the political realm here in Washington, D.C., to the spiritual realm and the hunt for an elusive ancient scroll that could help unlock some legendary biblical mysteries. Folks, you will not want to miss this. Stick around.
David Friedman has made history as the first ambassador to serve at the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. He plays a pivotal role in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and he'll be a special guest speaker at CUFI's 2019 Washington Summit. He's gone on to become one of the top voices in the U.S. administration, urging the president to move the U.S. Embassy and recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jewish state.
Tammy and I welcome you to the opening and dedication of the United States Embassy in Jerusalem, Israel.
CUFI is thrilled to announce that he'll be speaking at our 2019 CUFI Washington Summit during the National Night to Honor Israel. You won't want to miss this historic opportunity to hear from Ambassador Friedman and our many other special guests in person. Register now to attend the CUFI Washington Summit on July 8th and 9th.
And welcome back to part one of a very special two-part Watchman series from Washington, D.C. Now, one of the great pro-Israel advocates for years in this city has been Shelley Neese, whether working for the Jerusalem Connection or living, studying in Israel. Shelley has been at the forefront of advocating for Israel right here in the nation's capital. One of her main passions is the hunt for the Copper Scroll. What is the Copper Scroll? Well, Shelley has written a great new book called The Copper Scroll Project, which outlines this ancient and elusive biblical relic and what it could reveal about the Bible and God's plan for His land. Take a look.
The Copper Scroll is rare in that it was found by an archaeological team sponsored by the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. So it wasn't found just by roving Bedouins. Archaeologists and Bedouin, after those first Dead Sea Scrolls were proven authentic, it was a hunt for who could find them the quickest. The Bedouin usually won that race. In the Dead Sea area, caves pocket the limestone cliffs around it. And a lot of them, the entrances have collapsed during antiquity, and they're very hard to see just by the scanning eye. But they were able to find this cave, and they go inside, and they were very disappointed because there was 40 Dead Sea Scroll jars in cave number 3. But the ceiling of the cave had collapsed during antiquity. So almost every scroll was in a disintegrated state. But then on the very last day, day number 11 of them excavating cave number 3, in the very last hours, they come across what looks like a false wall. Almost a false wall of a secret castle chamber, but it was a limestone wall, and they chipped through it, and what they see is these 2 copper rolls resting on a man-made shelf behind it. So the copper scroll had actually been protected. Nature had created the perfect hiding spot. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not the Dead Sea Scrolls were deposited on the run, whether Jewish refugees fleeing Roman persecution deposited their scrolls from Jerusalem in the caves and thought they would come back and retrieve them one day. What the copper scroll was very unique in that it was obviously not deposited on the run. It was on a man-made shelf. It was strategically hidden. Now, after 2,000 years, copper did what copper does, and it was green, and it was brittle, and it crumbled at the slightest touch. So they put it in a museum in Jordan, and no one could figure out how to open it for 3 years. So what the copper scroll is, it's written out in 12 columns. It's a verbal treasure map. 12 columns, over 60 plus locations, and there's a certain style that it's writing. It always tells you, it's a dry inventory. It's basically verbless, but all of the 60 plus locations, it's telling you where to go, how deep to dig, and what you'll find once you do dig. The amount of treasure that is listed in the copper scroll, if talent in first century Jerusalem is equivalent to about 74 pounds. The amount of talents that are referred to in terms of buried treasure in the copper scroll would be the equivalent of 168 tons today. Copious amounts of gold, silver, and treasure. The copper scroll uses words like sacred, tithe, vessels. It never uses words that we know would be outright references to temple furniture. It doesn't say Ark of the Covenant. It doesn't say table of showbread or altar of incense. However, in one part, it does say priestly vestments. It'll say sacred vessels. So between knowing how much treasure the copper scroll is referring to and these certain keywords that refer to sacred vessels or priestly vestments, almost all scholars agree that the copper scroll was connected to the temple. And in fact, the copper scroll, what makes it so unique is that not only is it a verbal treasure map, but it's the only one of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Dead Sea Scroll collection that's written on metal and not papyrus or leather. In fact, there's nothing like it in all of antiquity, except for there was another copper scroll connected to Ramses II, and it also was an inventory of temple treasure. But inside Israel, the copper scroll is very unique unto itself, and we don't have anything else like it. Archaeology is a weapon for truth in Israel. Archaeology is how you show who has provenance in the land. And so if we could find something that could connect the Jewish history to Israel's modern dilemmas, this is how Israel's ancient past is tethered to her present. And that can be done through archaeology and nothing more so than the copper scroll. When I read the copper scroll, what I see it pointing to is that this is Israel's birthright. And Jim Barfield wants, and I want to be a part of returning that to Israel.
Coming up, my final thoughts from here in Washington, D.C. on how Christians United for Israel, CUFI, is fighting back against the rise of anti-Semitism around the world and in your backyard, and how you can play a major role in helping us. Stick around.
The silence of millions of Christian bystanders during Hitler's rise to power emboldened the Nazis to carry out their evil extermination plan against the Jewish people. Today, anti-Semitism is on the rise again, and some are even claiming the Holocaust never happened. As Christians, we must not be silent in response to these lies.
To see evil and not call it evil is evil. Not to act is to act. Not to speak is to speak.
This month, CUFI is offering a powerful new mini-book, The Sin of Silence, which documents the first-hand accounts of both the perpetrators and witnesses of the Holocaust. As the generation that experienced the Holocaust disappears, we must keep the memories of these witnesses alive to ensure that such a horror never happens again. Call Christians United for Israel at 210-477-4714 or go to kufi.org/silence to receive your copy of The Sin of Silence when you support Kufi with a gift of any amount.
And welcome back to The Watchman. We are wrapping up part one of our special two-part Watchman series from here in the nation's capital. Our team at Kufi is fighting anti-Semitism, advocating for Israel at the grassroots level, in your church, in your community, and also right here on Capitol Hill. And it kind of all comes together, all those different legs of our pro-Israel activism at our Kufi Washington Summit. Right here in Washington, D.C., you will see some incredible speakers, including our founder and chairman, the one and only Pastor John Hagee, the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Ambassador David Friedman, Dennis Prager, nationally syndicated talk radio host, and some very special top officials from the Trump administration who we will announce shortly, and also none other than Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from Jerusalem, delivering a satellite address. Yours truly, The Watchman, will also be speaking and in attendance at our Kufi Washington Summit. Folks, this is the premier pro-Israel event in the United States. Raise your voice to put your faith into action alongside thousands of like-minded, Bible-believing, pro-Israel Christians for such a time as this. If not us, who? And if not now, when? Visit cufi.org, join the movement, and register for our Kufi Washington Summit today. Well, we'll be back here in Washington, D.C. next week for part two of this special two-part series from the nation's capital with Pastor John Hagee joining us right here in D.C. Until then, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace.